It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're leaving behind the chandeliers and courtly dances of Versailles to follow someone else entirely. Someone who's never seen a golden hallway, but smells like wet hay and wood smoke. Someone whose bed is stuffed with straw and whose taxes might cost them their dinner. This is what life was really like for the peasants outside the Palace of Versailles. Not a satire, not a pity tour, just a quiet remembering. And before we begin, if this kind of gentle, human storytelling helps you sleep or helps you feel a little less alone, please do subscribe. It makes more of a difference than you know. And if you're upright, now tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it? Now dim the lights, and let's drift back in time. Before Versailles became the sunlit stage of absolutism, it was a swamp. That's not metaphor, that's landscaping. Louis XIV built his empire on drained marshland, where waterlogged roots once groped toward a grey sky. And just past the trimmed hedges and fountains, that soft, silty ground continued carrying peasants who were anything but ornamental. They did not bathe in marble basins. They bathed in rivers, or, more likely, didn't bathe much at all. Their economy ran not on gold, but on manure. This isn't poetic exaggeration. Manure animal dung was the currency of fertility, exchanged in invisible deals between neighbors and pastures. Cows were not just livestock, but walking deposits of future harvests. Chickens contributed not only eggs, but essential nitrogen. If a noble's power gleamed from a powdered wig, a peasant's power came in the form of a steaming pile left behind a barn. In springtime, this fact was impossible to forget. Peasants half drunk on the scent of fermenting hay and sheep urine-tilled what little land they had with wooden plows handed down like heirlooms. These were not farms like we imagine them, quaint, lush, manageable. They were more like battlegrounds against rock, rot, and frost. A bad year could mean nothing grew. A good year could mean the taxman came smiling, because more grain meant more dues. There were no seasons without cost. They lived in dirt-floored homes. Home is the word we can use. Picture a one-room hut with one bed, a fire pit, and straw stuffed into cracks to keep out the wind. Chickens roamed freely inside because a fox couldn't be trusted and no one could afford a coop. Children were swaddled not for fashion, but to prevent wandering into flames. And then there was the bread. Bread was everything. And bread was almost always terrible. The best bread was white, which is to say, wheat, sifted and soft. Peasant bread was black, a stone-heavy loaf made of rye, or barley, or whatever was left over after the nobility took their cut. Sometimes it was cut with powdered beans, sometimes with chalk, sometimes, during famine, with sawdust. Yes, actual sawdust. It filled the stomach, but not the soul. It made the belly hard, but left the face hollow. There is a record from 1700 for during what they called a hungry year, where a village doctor noted the rise of something called pain de désespoir, bread of despair. If you ate it, you might live. If you didn't, you'd starve. Those were the options, and yet they kept going. It's difficult to understand just how much a tax can hurt when you've never paid one in chickens. In the shadow of Versailles golden gates, the real cost of royalty wasn't just extravagance, it was extraction. The French tax system, in the decades before Revolution, was not merely corrupt, it was operatic in its cruelty. There was the tail, a direct land tax, supposedly levied on all commoners, but nobles, of course, were exempt. Then came the gabelle, the salt tax, because every peasant needs salt to preserve food, but God forbid it be affordable. You were legally required to buy a certain amount of salt, even if you didn't need it, and only from the royal vendor, and only at the royal price. Salt, simple, mineral, tasteless salt, became a symbol of unfreedom. And finally, there was the corvée, a tax of time, days, sometimes weeks, of unpaid labor on roads or ditches or palatial projects. A peasant could be summoned away from his farm during harvest, and if he refused, well, refusal was a kind of treason. No lawyer, no mercy, just the slow arithmetic of vanishing hours. A man could be taxed in coin, in grain, in blood, or in back pain, and by the end of it, he had almost nothing left except teeth, which, if we're honest, were in poor shape too. Toothache was a constant companion. Molars cracked on stones in flour. Abscesses festered with no hope of surgery. There are accounts of peasants tying cords round their own rotten teeth and yanking them out with door hinges. No anesthetic, just pain and a prayer. Because dentistry was a luxury, and pain, for them, was not a deviation from normal life, was woven into it. The silence, too, was deafening. Peasants didn't write diaries. Their stories weren't penned in the court gazette or embroidered into tapestries. They lived, suffered, and died, largely unwritten. But we can still find traces in the fines they paid for stealing firewood, in the baptismal registers listing 5 children born and 3 buried, in the sudden, desperate revolts that flared up like brush fires and vanished just as quickly. No monuments were built in their honor, no biography, no busts, only the whisper of their footprints packed into muddy paths that led away from the palace and into the woods. And it is worth pausing, just for a second, to ask, what does it mean that so much of a country can be forgotten by its own story? And more urgently, how many people are still living that way now? Imagine hunger not as a moment, but as a time of year. In the countryside around Versailles, hunger had a rhythm. It wasn't just a consequence of bad luck. It was baked into the cycle of the calendar, like winter or spring. They called it the soudar, the lean season. It came in late spring, ironically, just before the first harvest, when last year's stores had run dry, and this year's fields were still just green promises. During the soudar, bellies growled louder than church bells. Grain merchants raised prices, bakers shrank loaves, and women wept softly into soups made mostly of water. You might walk into a village and see children with swollen belly snot from gluttony, but from malnutrition, their faces drawn, their arms thin as sticks, their eyes much too old for their size. Mothers would chew food before feeding it to their infants, softening even the hardest crust. And when food ran out, they fed stories instead. Fairy tales, not the sugar-coated ones, the old, grim ones, where children are lost, where hunger talks, where witches offer bread that always comes at a cost. The brothers Grimm would later write them down in Germany, but the peasants of France lived them. There are records too many to number of foraged roots, bark ground into powder, nettles boiled into green paste. There were mushrooms that killed, and mushrooms that healed, and no reliable guide between them. If your grandmother knew the difference, you lived. If she didn't, you joined the long line of peasant graves. But hunger didn't just hollow the stomach. It shaped everything. It changed how people walked slowly, carefully, as if their legs were too expensive to waste. It dictated marriages. Who could afford a dowry? Who had enough flour to host a wedding? It altered dreams. Some dreamed of bread, others dreamed of escape. But where could a peasant go? Cities were crowded and cruel. The army was brutal and rarely paid. The church might take you in, but God demanded silence, labor, and more tithes. And so most stayed, not because they loved the land, but because the land, even in its stinginess, was the only place that knew their name. And every now and then, in a good year, they feasted, not in a banquet hall, but in a barn, with cider, coarse bread, hard cheese, and laughter that spilled into the night. Laughter that sounded like rebellions, soft, exhausted, but still alive. Even then, they knew the hunger would come back. But for a night, they danced anyway. To be a peasant outside Versailles was to live in a kind of suspended privacy, hidden from history, but not from each other. The village was not a quaint postcard. It was an organism, a living body of shared luck and mutual grievance, stitched together by rumor, birth, and soil. Most people never traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. Roads were treacherous. Maps were rare. And the wider world was less of a place than a myth told by returning soldiers, whose stories were swollen with half-truths and wine. Your universe was your village, the same 20 or 30 families, over and over, until your face resembled your cousin's, and your cousin resembled your grief. Homes leaned into each other like conspirators. They weren't built for beauty, but for survival. Roofs were thatched with straw, walls made of wattle and daub mud smeared over lattice of wood. In winter, the cold crawled in like a stray animal. You kept it out with fire, body heat, and occasionally the company of a goat. Yes, a goat, because a goat gave milk and warmth, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a reason to laugh. Villagers had no clocks. Time was told by the bell in the church tower, or the position of the sun, or the ache in your back. And yet, life had rhythm. You rose with the light. You prayed, often, not always devoutly, but ritually. You worked, almost always barefoot. You mended what was broken. You sang while harvesting. You courted in glances. You mourned in silence. There were customs. Each village had its own. Some blessed their tools before sowing. Others marked the first snowfall with a procession. A few believed that bread baked on All Saints' Day could never mold, and kept it on the mantle all year like a holy fossil. These were not superstitions, exactly. They were emotional anchors. When nothing else could be controlled, not the frost, not the taxes, not even your own stomach-you controlled meaning. You shaped belief from desperation, and there was a strange kind of freedom in that. A liberty of the imagination when all else was limited. Neighbors helped each other not because they were good, but because they had no choice. If your roof leaked and the village cooper didn't help you mend it, his might be next. If your cow died and no one shared milk, what happened when theirs did? It was not kindness. It was interdependence, a web. And if you cut one thread, the whole thing trembled. Peasant life was full of judgment, yes, of gossip, suspicion, and occasional violence, but also of memory, song, and solidarity. When someone died, the whole village felt it, not out of sentiment, but because death left a hole in the pattern, and even the smallest stitch mattered. It is a cruel trick of geography that some peasants lived just miles from the Palace of Versailles and never once saw its walls. To them, the palace was not a symbol. It was a rumor, a bright lie glittering just beyond the treetops. They heard of its fountains once that flowed without a spring, of mirrors larger than barns, of a bed so grand it required its own ceremony, and a king who rose to applause. But what they actually saw was different. They saw the back roads trampled by carts bringing marble and meat to the palace kitchens. They saw woodcutters fined for stealing royal lumber to keep their babies warm in January. They saw gamekeepers patrolling the forests with muskets, guarding deer more valuable than people. To kill a rabbit on royal land could cost you your life. But to lose a child to Coldwell, that was simply the will of God. Versailles cast a long shadow, even when the sun was shining. Sometimes, peasants were brought to the palace grounds, not to marvel but to work. They dug ditches. They trimmed hedges for gardens they were never allowed to enter. They hauled stones up hills for statues of Greek gods whose names they did not know. Some were conscripted into service for noble households. Kitchen boys, scullery maids, stable hands half invisible, but always watching. They saw powdered faces, corsets so tight they bruised the ribs, and wigs taller than children. They watched lords complain that the pheasant was overcooked. And then they walked home barefoot through the mud to eat broth flavored with regret. The contrast was unbearable, but it was also instructive, because to see Versailles up close was to understand that luxury had nothing to do with happiness. That grandeur did not soften cruelty, it disguised it. One servant wrote in a letter, "The walls are gold, but the hearts are stone." And back in the village, those who had seen the palace became a kind of oracle. They described golden gates, and people listened in silence, not with envy, but with a kind of anthropological awe, as if Versailles were another planet, one orbiting their own, yet forever out of reach. Some prayed for the king, some cursed him, most simply survived him. And perhaps that was the greatest act of defiance, to survive Versailles by never entering it. A peasant's life was not measured in years. It was measured in blisters. A soft palm was suspicious, an unscarred shin an anomaly. The body was not a temple, it was a tool, and tools were meant to break. Children began labor as soon as they could hold something heavier than a spoon. Some shepherded geese before they could write their names. Girls learned to thatch, and so long before their hips grew wide enough for childbirth. And boys learned the weight of a scythe as soon as they stopped growing. Muscles grew not in gyms, but in fields. Calluses were a kind of identity. If you didn't have them, you didn't belong. Feet, especially, told the truth. Most peasants owned one pair of shoes. Some owned none. They walked on frozen soil, sharp stones, animal dung, and paths made slick by the long rot of fallen leaves. They bled, they limped, they did not complain. Not because they were proud, because no one would listen. The pain of the body was a fact of existence, like sunrise, like taxes, like death. There are paintings mostly imagined, mostly romantic, that show peasants dancing. Yes, they danced, but they also limped. And when they laughed, it was often through missing teeth. Injury was not exceptional, it was constant. A twisted ankle during harvest could mean no bread for winter. A cut infected by manure could become fatal within days. There were no hospitals for the poor, only prayers, poultices, and the stubbornness of the human body. Midwives were the closest thing to doctors. They knew how to set a bone, how to coax a baby out of a dying woman, how to stop the bleeding with herbs and pressure. They were respected, feared, sometimes accused of witchcraft, but mostly they were overworked and underfed, and through it all the body kept going, bent, blistered, but alive. That was the miracle no one painted. Not the birth of kings, but the endurance of peasants. A spine that didn't break after 20 years of lifting. Hands that still wove after decades of digging. A heart that kept beating, even when there was nothing to beat for. Their strength was not admirable, it was tragic. They were strong because they had to be, and no one ever thanked them for it. It might surprise you, but peasants did sleep, just not like we do. Sleep came in scraps, stolen between chores, interrupted by hunger, rarely uninterrupted by comfort. There was no mattress to fall into, only straw, sometimes replaced with dried leaves, sometimes nothing at all. And that straw, it crawled. Lice, fleas, the occasional beetle. Blankets were rare, quilts rarer still. You warmed yourself by proximity. A spouse, a sibling, maybe the family dog curled at your knees. Privacy was a modern invention. Back then, sleep was communal, loud, smelly, and public. A single room might hold parents, children, grandparents, and animals. One corner for sleeping, another for tools, a third for firewood, and all of it damp. If someone snored, you lived with it. If someone wept in their sleep, you pretended not to hear. Dreams, if they came, were shaped by exhaustion. There's no poetry in that, just biology. A body that's been pushed all day rarely needs coaxing. It drops. But sleep was not one long stretch. It was segmented. A first sleep, a waking period, then a second sleep. During the waking period, often around midnight, people prayed, smoked pipes, whispered to each other, made love if they had the energy. It was a quiet pause, a kind of midnight intermission, and then they slept again. Modern researchers have confirmed this rhythm. It was common across Europe for centuries. But in a peasant's hut, it had a different flavor. It wasn't leisurely, it was survival. The fires had to be tended. Children woke, crying from cold. The wind howled through chinks in the wall, carrying the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was prehistoric. And when you woke in the morning, it wasn't to an alarm. It was to a rooster, to a backache, to your own cough. Waking was not a fresh start. It was a continuation of strain. And yet, despite the fatigue, despite the straw, despite the aching knees and creaking bones, somewhere in that dark room, someone might have whispered a joke. Someone might have reached out to hold someone else's hand. And in that moment, sleep did what it still does. It softened the edge of suffering. It wrapped the day in forgetfulness and let the body begin again. There is an image painted in oils and fairy tales of rustic love. Two peasants in a wheat field, holding hands, laughing between bundles of harvest. Forget it. Love, for peasants, was not a story. It was an arrangement. Marriage wasn't about romance. It was about land, or tools, or dowries paid in geese. You didn't marry because of butterflies. You married because her father had a wheelbarrow you needed, or because your families had lived side by side for 30 years and it was expected. There were dances, yes. There were stolen glances behind the chapel, yes. But most of all, there were calculations. Can she carry water? Can he plow straight? Will her hips bear children? Will his back hold out until the next harvest? And once the vows were spoken, often in hurried ceremonies shared with 2 or 3 other couples, life resumed immediately. There was no honeymoon, no new home, just the same tools, the same walls, the same aching hands. But within that arrangement, sometimes, love grew anyway. Not the love of poems, the love of habit, of shared fatigue, of knowing someone else understands the precise texture of your day. There are records of husbands weaving straw shoes for wives whose feet blistered to easily, of wives saving the last scrap of cheese, quietly, for their husband's return from the fields. Small mercies, mutual endurance. And of course, there were bad matches, men who drank, women who resented, arguments whispered at night so as not to wake the baby, or the goat, or God. Divorce was not an option. You stayed, you swallowed. You survived. Sex was expected, but not spoken of, except in jokes, dirty, loud, communal jokes that peasants told to make themselves laugh, through their own awkwardness. Children came quickly, sometimes too quickly, and every child was a new mouth to feed, a new prayer against death, a new chance to remake the future or repeat the past. Still, even in the roughest homes, there were gestures. A sprig of flowers in the hair, a borrowed ribbon, a lullaby sung with a voice so cracked it could only be honest. Peasant love was not glamorous, but it was real, built not on fantasy, but on fatigue, forgiveness, and the faint, stubborn hope that tomorrow would be kinder than today. In peasant France, to be born was an act of audacity. There were no hospitals, no white sheets, no sterile instruments waiting in a metal tray. There was only a floor, a fire, and a midwife with trembling hands that knew more than most priests. Birth happened wherever it needed to, on a pile of old cloth, beside a smoking hearth, in the middle of a harvest field if the baby came too fast. The mother bit down on rags or wood or her own tongue. There were no painkillers, no anesthesia, only breath, prayer, and the thick smell of sweat and iron. Midwives were both feared and revered, witches to some, saints to others. They knew herbs that could calm bleeding, how to shift a baby stuck in the womb, how to recognize the scream that meant death had arrived early. They had seen everything: torn bodies, stillborn children, mothers who bled out in minutes, and yet they kept coming when summoned, with their bag of rags, their bundle of herbs, and their quiet, urgent courage. Infant mortality was not a possibility, it was an expectation. Some parishes lost half their babies before the age of 5, and every mother carried the weight of ghosts beneath her apron. Naming a child too early was considered bad luck. Some waited days, even weeks, because love makes loss sharper, and they knew too well the pain of burying a name. But for those who survived the lucky ones, childhood was not a grace. It was a smaller version of adulthood. Miniature tools, miniature tasks, miniature traumas. Girls learned to soothe infants while still bleeding from their first moon. Boys drove oxen before they could spell. And the mothers, they kept moving. Even after childbirth, there was no rest. The fields still needed tending. The firewood still needed splitting. Their bodies bore the marks, sagging from endless pregnancies. Spines curved from lifting too soon. Hands rough from grinding grain, folding linen, milking goats. And yet, somehow dash, there was often singing, not for joy, but for rhythm, for sanity. Lullabies were whispered hymns against despair. And when a child lived past 5, the whole village noticed. Gifts were given, bread was shared. It was a miracle, and they treated it as such. Not because they were naive, but because when life was made of pain, you had to celebrate survival. Every time you wake one morning and your joints ache. Not from labor though, that too, but from something deeper, something humming beneath the skin. In a peasant village near Versailles, this was how illness began, quietly, without fanfare, without names. You coughed, you shivered, you prayed. Medicine, as we understand it, did not exist. There were remedies, yes, but they were equal parts science, superstition, and inherited desperation. Boiled moss for fever, wormwood for stomach aches, a poultice of crushed snails for infections. Some of it worked, most of it didn't, but trying anything was better than nothing, because nothing meant dying. There were healers, of course. The village wise woman who knew which plants to steep, which prayers to whisper. Sometimes she wore herbs in her hair, or carried bones for protection. Other times, she looked just like your aunt. But if too many people died under her care, she might be accused of sorcery. Not officially, not always in court, but in whispers, in glances, in the sudden silence when she walked past. They were traveling quacks, two men in patched cloaks with bottles of colored water and promises of miracle cures. They charged too much. They stayed too little. When plague came, real plague, it was like winter with a face. People collapsed mid-prayer. Boils bubbled along armpits, necks, groins. Fever made the strong delirious, the weak transparent. The church bells rang too often, and funerals became quiet affairs. No singing, no procession, just dirt and fear. If one house caught it, the others shut their doors, sometimes literally boarded them up, not out of cruelty, out of survival. But most illness wasn't plague. It was slower, consumption, ague, fevers without names, and above all, hunger, sickness. The way a body fades, not from poison, but from nothing. How the hands tremble, how the belly swells with air, how the mind grows fogged from want. They did not understand calories or bacteria or malnutrition, but they understood what it felt like to waste. And still, they worked. They pushed their aching frames into the fields, into the woods, into the firelit corners of their huts, because to be still was to be suspicious. To rest was to invite death. Even the dying tried to die upright. And sometimes, in the quietest hours, someone might sing at a bedside, not to cure, but to soften the leaving, to remind the ones slipping away that they had been seen, that their suffering mattered, that even if history forgot them, someone had stayed until the end. To be a peasant in the shadow of Versailles was to live constantly beneath two kings. One wore silk and one wore thorns. One walked palace halls, and the other hung from a cross. And strangely, it was the second king, the bleeding one, that peasants trusted more. Religion in rural France was not about doctrine, it was about endurance. Church wasn't a place for lofty sermons or theological debates. It was where you went because your parents had gone, because to not go was to invite questions, because sometimes it was the only stone building you'd ever enter. The priest might be kind, he might be corrupt, he might be drunk before the second hymn, but he was necessary. He baptized, he married, he buried, and in between, he listened. Sometimes, peasants prayed, not for virtue, but for survival. God was not a comfort, he was a landlord, and you begged him like you begged all landlords, with fear. But within that fear, there was intimacy. They believed in saints, real saints, patrons of toothaches, of lost cows, of children who wouldn't sleep. They tied rags to trees near sacred springs. They whispered prayers into cracked statues. They lit candles for things too small to confess. It wasn't pretty, this faith. It was muddy, half-remembered, desperate. But it was theirs, and it was full of ghosts. The dead were everywhere, in the candle smoke, in the bell tolls, in the empty place at table during winter. Peasants didn't believe in oblivion. They believed in presence, that the dead still walked the paths between fields, that they listened, that they judged. And so they honored them with scraps of bread left at crossroads, with muttered apologies, with sudden silences when someone's name was mentioned. Faith wasn't a shield, it was a story. A long, cracked, half-true story that said, yes, you are suffering, but you are not alone. And that mattered. Because when your world is made of wood, mud, and grief, a single candle in the chapel feels like proof that light is possible. Even if it flickers, even if it goes out. In the hollows between church bells, something older lived. It crept through hedgerows, crouched under eaves, and flickered in the eyes of women who knew too much about roots. This was the other faith, the unofficial one, not written in scripture, but whispered in kitchens. Superstition. The church called it heresy, but to the peasant, it was insurance. You wore a charm around your neck not because you didn't believe in God, but because God was busy. And sometimes it was the rosemary in your shoe that kept your child from coughing through the night. The world was full of things that couldn't be seen, but still harmed. The evil eye, a glance that curdled milk or soured the womb. The loup-garou, the werewolf, who stalked the forest paths when the moon was too full. The revenant, the returning dead, restless and unsatisfied. It wasn't theatre, it was practical. If your crops failed, was it God's will? Or did your neighbor bury something cursed near your barn? Which bottles were real buried under thresholds to trap malevolent spirits, filled with hair, nails, blood? A peasant's version of a firewall. The logic wasn't science, it was symmetry. If pain came from nowhere, surely some force had sent it. If joy was rare, it had to be protected. Women were the keepers of this hidden knowledge. Not witches, not quite, but holders of old truths. They brewed teas that cured colic, hung herbs in windows to keep lightning from striking, refused to say certain names after dark, and people listened, because they remembered what happened when they didn't. Superstition was not childish, it was cautious. In a world with no doctors, no therapists, no guarantees, belief filled the cracks. A sprig of lavender over the door, a red string tied around a baby's wrist, a candle left burning just a little longer because someone in the room felt watched. They did not call it magic, but they knew what it meant to be haunted by grief, by fear, by things they had no words for, and so they named them, not to summon, but to survive. For a peasant, holiness was never clean. It bled, it limped, it bore the marks of its own crucifixion. The saints they clung to were not radiant figures floating above the clouds. They were disfigured, broken, burned. They were people who had suffered more than they had and, yet somehow, kept their faith. There was Saint Fiacre, patron of gardeners and hemorrhoids. Saint Apollonia, whose teeth were torn out and who now comforted the toothless. Saint Isidore, a peasant himself, whose plough was said to be guided by angels. These weren't distant figures, they were familiar. Saint Apollonia knew what it meant to scream without help. Saint Isidore knew the burn in your shoulders after 5 hours bent over in frozen soil. They were not loved because they were powerful. They were loved because they were survivors. The church taught that suffering brought you closer to Christ. But the peasants already knew that. They felt it in their knees, in their empty stomachs, in the slow decay of their teeth. They didn't need sermons to understand the holiness of hunger, and still they prayed. They prayed not for wealth, but for endurance, not for miracles, but for margins. One more sack of grain, one more healthy child, one more year without frost. Pilgrimages were rare but powerful. Some saved for years to walk to a sacred shrine, carrying wounds, debts, desperate hopes. There, they would kneel in mud beside nobles, beside thieves, beside people whose names they'd never know. And for a moment, the illusion of class fell away. Everyone bowed the same. There was something deeply democratic in that, a leveling, not of wealth, but of need. And when they returned, feet blistered, soul lighter, they brought back a relic, a scrap of cloth, a vial of holy water, a pebble from the shrine's path, not to show off, to remember that once they asked for something, and dared to believe it might be heard. In a world where the king was unreachable, and justice came late or never, they turned to Saintsfold, wounded, dead because They were the only ones who listened, not because they could fix it, but because they didn't look away. Time in a peasant's life did not pass. It turned. The calendar was not measured in months, but in saints' days, harvests, and holy feasts. A spiral, not a line, and every turn was sacred, or superstitious, or both. You knew it was Candlemas because the priest blessed every taper in town. You knew it was St. John's Day because the village bonfire burned high enough to singe the sky. You knew it was Lent because the air grew quiet and meat vanished from your plate. Fasting was not optional, it was doctrine. The church mandated over 150 days of fasting a year. For the noble, it was a ritual. For the peasant, it was a tautology. You fasted not because you were holy, but because you were poor. There was no meat to begin with, only beans, only bread, only hunger. Still, the rituals gave structure to the chaos. On certain days, you could not work. On others, you had to. Feast days were both sacred and secular. They were the few days you might dance without guilt, sing without fear. Entire villages gathered for processions, wooden saints carried on shoulders, flowers scattered under feet, incense clouding the path like holy fog. Children were dressed in their cleanest tunics. The old murmured prayers with calloused fingers crossed behind their backs. Young men flirted awkwardly in the shadow of relics. And afterward, if the harvest had been kind, there might be a roast, or cider, or a pie made of something sweet, something rare. That joy wasn't an indulgence, it was a defense, because joy said, "We are still here." And they knew deep in their bones that joy and grief were not opposites, they were companions. Every feast followed a famine. Every laughter echoed from a grave. The sacred made the unbearable endurable, because to suffer without meaning is to drown. But to suffer within a pattern, to believe your pain matters to someone, somewhere, even if only a saint carved in wood. That is how you breathe, even in the flood. Death did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in through the smoke hole, or down the chimney, or sat quietly by the hearth until it was time. Peasants didn't fear death, they accommodated it. They made room. A body might be laid on a plank of wood, covered with a sheet stiff from age, and surrounded by candles too short to finish the night. Neighbors filed in, crossing themselves, whispering, leaving bread or coins or simply presents. The priest would come, eventually, sometimes with oils, sometimes too late. But even without him, the village knew what to do. Women washed the body gently, even if they didn't like the deceased. The dead deserved clean skin. Children were ushered outside, unless they were old enough to help. There were prayers, yes, but also gossip and silence, because mourning wasn't private. It was public, collective. A death was not just a loss, it was a rearranging of the pattern. Someone who had always been there wasn't, and that absence echoed. Peasants didn't embalm, didn't enshrine. They buried quickly, before the body turned, in graves marked with wood that would rot by the time anyone might return. But they remembered. Candles were lit on anniversaries. Bread was left on windowsills during All Souls, and sometimes, in the wind, you could hear someone mutter a name to no one at all. They didn't speak of heaven much, not the way we do, not as reward, not as comfort, but as continuity. The dead were still part of the village, invisible but not gone, like breath in cold air. And they didn't always stay where they were buried. Some were said to visit, a cold touch on the shoulder, a whisper during harvest, a face glimpsed in a pane of dirty glass, not frightening, just known. Because if the living were ignored by history, the dead were ignored by God, and so they stayed near. It wasn't morbid, it was normal. Death was not the end, it was the next room over, and the door, most days, was left slightly ajar. Bread was not food, it was time, labor, weather, tax, hope, and often betrayal. In the fields surrounding Versailles, every loaf came at a cost, not just in sweat, but in politics. Wheat was precious, not because it was rare, but because it was controlled. Grain markets were rigged by those who had never touched soil. Middlemen hoarded, prices soared, and when they soared too high, the people starved. The state could intervene. Sometimes it did. More often, it didn't, because profit trumped mercy, because famine was not always an accident. Sometimes it was policy. A bad harvest meant lean tables. A manipulated harvest meant empty ones. And the people knew. There are letters smuggled, scribbled, forgotten where villagers begged their magistrates for grain. Not for free, just at a price they could live with. We will pay, they wrote, but we cannot pay in children. That wasn't metaphor. Some families sent their sons to work far from home, into the army, into the woods, into death, because there was no bread left to share. And when things grew desperate, bakeries became battlegrounds. Women, especially, led the charge, because they were the ones who baked, who rationed, who counted the days between flour sacks. They knew what hunger did to a child's eyes. They knew the sound of a husband growing quiet, not from temper, but from emptiness. They rioted not because they hated the baker, but because the loaf had become a symbol of all they'd been denied. Some stole, some bartered with the little they had, a hen, a necklace, a favor, and some, trembling, began to ask more dangerous questions. Why does the king eat cake when we cannot afford crusts? Why do courtiers drown in wine while we drink river water thick with leeches? Revolution does not begin with a guillotine. It begins with a loaf, or the lack of one, and still somehow they endured. They stretched gruel with ashes. They soaked stale bread in broth until it became something like food. They taught their children not to cry when their stomachs growled. And when the new wheat finally came in, when the first loaves were baked from a fresh harvest, they didn't celebrate. They simply breathed, not because they were full, but because they were, at last, not empty. Famine rarely announces itself. It does not ride into town with drums or banners. It creeps in, slow and indistinct, like fog on a winter morning. First, the bread shrinks. The baker says there is less flour this week. Then, the butcher says the pig never came. Then, the market is just smaller, quieter. People begin to whisper. Have you heard about the next village? They say children are eating grass. They say the priest gave his last loaf to a widow. Then the rumors stopped being rumors. A girl faints while drawing water. A man is found dead beside the road, his pockets filled with moss and bark. A child disappears, and nobody asks where. In the countryside around Versailles, there were famines that left no names, only holes in baptismal records. Years where half the village vanished, and no one bothered to write it down, because what was there to say? The wheat failed, the soup was thin. We tried. In those years, people turned on themselves. Not violently, not yet, but in ways that hurt deeper. A father might sell his tools for a bag of flour. A mother might give the last crust to the quietest child and pretend she had already eaten. Priests preached endurance, but endurance didn't fill your gut. And some nights, entire families would lie in silence, too hungry to speak. not asleep, just waiting. Famine changed your thoughts. You began to see food everywhere, in tree bark, in candle wax, in the soft flesh of your own arm. People wrote about these things later, scholars, doctors, none of them hungry. But the peasants didn't write. They just endured and endured, until the rains returned, until the wheat grew tall again, and then famine vanished just as quietly as it came. No apology, no explanation, just green shoots rising where the silence had been, and people emerged, thinner, grayer, more afraid, but still here. That was their gift, their curse. They kept surviving, even when survival wasn't fair, even when it wasn't enough. What did a peasant eat when they ate well? Not often, but sometimes. There were feasts, not royal ones, not velvet and venison, but local, earned, and brief. A wedding, a good harvest. The safe return of someone who had gone too long into the woods, or into war, or into childbirth. On those days, the village breathed differently. You could smell the joy in the air, onions frying, cider warming, bread rising like a promise. Peasant cooking was not elegant, but it was inventive. They boiled everything, because boiling stretched a meal, softened roots, and made even old meat bearable. Stews were thick with barley, cabbage, garlic, sometimes beans. And if you were lucky, pork fat, just a sliver, just enough to make the pot sing. They baked bread in communal ovens, great stone mouths, fed by whole neighborhoods. Women took turns, and the flour was precious. If someone spilled it, there was no laughter. Eggs were rare. Chickens laid seasonally, and even then, the eggs were more valuable for trade than taste. Milk came straight from the udder, and it turned quickly, so butter and cheese were more common. Dense, sharp, aged in cellars full of mold and hope. There were root turnips, beets, carrots twisted like old hands. Wild greens foraged from the forest edge. Mushrooms too, though always with caution. One wrong cap could end a family. Spices, salt, if you could afford the tax, garlic, always, and sometimes vinegar to make the bad things taste like something. Sweets were for saints' days. Maybe a tart made with boiled down apples, or honey if someone kept bees. But most days, no, most days were gruel. Gruel and a quiet prayer for something better. Still, those rare meals, those festival stews and loaves shared in smoke and laughter, those stuck in the memory. Children remembered them for years. Old men talked about a single meat pie the way others might talk about first love. A woman might smile to herself while shelling beans, thinking of the roast goose served at her sister's wedding. Because food, for them, was not just sustenance, it was dignity. It was joy when joy was allowed. It was the proof that even in hunger, even in want, there were still things worth tasting, worth remembering, worth sharing, even if it was just a heel of bread, dipped in broth and passed to a friend with hands as cracked as yours. Not every hunger is physical, and peasants knew that too. There were hungers that sat deeper than the gut, hungers for rest, for silence, for meaning, for someone to listen when you spoke and not walk away before you were done. You could be full of soup and still feel empty. Some days, the work was so repetitive, so grinding, so pointless seeming, that it scraped against your thoughts like stone on stone. Dig here, stack this, feed the pig, fetch the wood. Repeat, who were you beyond your chores? The church said, a child of God. The taxman said, a source of revenue. The landlord said, a tenant, a nuisance, a number. But you didn't say much at all. Because if you spoke of longing real longing, you'd be met with confusion, wanting more than food, more than shelter. Who did you think you were? And yet the hunger lingered. It showed up in dreams of warm rooms, of laughter without fear, of your name spoken kindly by someone who meant it. It echoed in lullabies, in old stories your grandmother whispered when she thought no one else was listening. It curled itself around your ribs when you watched someone die too young, and wondered why no one in power noticed or cared. This kind of hunger couldn't be fixed with bread. It required beauty, or love, or the dangerous, heretical idea that even a peasant might deserve joy. Sometimes it flared into rebellion, sometimes into madness. Sometimes it just sank deep into the body and stayed there, like a stone in the gut. Peasants didn't have language for existential dread, but they lived it. They didn't have therapy. They had superstition, and wine, if the harvest was kind. Mostly, they had each other. The quiet glance, the offered hand, the shared silence when words would only make things worse. Not everything needed saying, and not everything could be said, but they felt it. That aching, that emptiness, that had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with being born in a world that never asked what you wanted, only what you could endure. There's a difference between having little and being asked to give what little you have. And peasants, especially those just beyond the gilt breath of Versailles, were always being asked. A portion of their harvest, a percentage of their livestock, a fraction of their hours, their children, their future. They gave, not because they could afford it, but because they had no choice. The church asked for tithes, the nobility asked for dues, the king asked for obedience, and still they gave more. Their time first, not just in labor, but in waiting. Waiting for a verdict, for a storm to pass, for a child's fever to break, for news that never came. Then their bodies, bent backs, raw hands, hips pushed to their limits in childbearing, shoulders carrying sacks heavier than their own grief. Then their names, because history rarely wrote them down. They became the people, the poor, the masses, singular only in suffering. And finally, they gave up wanting, not entirely, but enough. They learned not to wish too loudly, not to dream too vividly, not to stare too long at the lights flickering from Versailles, where laughter was constant and plates never empty. They knew what happened to those who wanted too much: disappointment, exile, sometimes revolution. So they lowered their eyes, softened their hopes, taught their children to be content with crumbs, not because they lacked imagination, but because desire had become dangerous. Even love had to be rationed. How do you raise 6 children when you can barely feed 2? How do you grieve when mourning takes time you don't have? So they became efficient with affection. A hand on the shoulder, a nod across a field, a quiet lullaby without a smile. And yet they kept something, a thread of resistance, woven into the dull fabric of survival, a song hummed under the breath, a stolen moment of joy, a secret name for a baby whispered before baptisms, just in case the priests, God, wasn't listening, but the old gods were. They gave up much, but not everything, because even in hunger, even in darkness, even in lives written in mud, they knew there were parts of themselves the world couldn't take, not without a fight. There's a difference between having little and being asked to give what little you have. And peasants, especially those just beyond the gilt breath of Versailles, were always being asked. A portion of their harvest, a percentage of their livestock, a fraction of their hours, their children, their future. They gave, not because they could afford it, but because they had no choice. The church asked for tithes. The nobility asked for dues. The king asked for obedience. And still, they gave more, their time first, not just in labor, but in waiting. Waiting for a verdict, for a storm to pass, for a child's fever to break, for news that never came. Then their bodies, bent backs, raw hands, hips pushed to their limits in childbearing, shoulders carrying sacks heavier than their own grief. Then their names, because history rarely wrote them down. They became the people, the poor, the masses, singular only in suffering. And finally, they gave up wanting, not entirely, but enough. They learned not to wish too loudly, not to dream too vividly, not to stare too long at the lights flickering from Versailles, where laughter was constant and plates never empty. They knew what happened to those who wanted too much: disappointment, exile, sometimes revolution. So they lowered their eyes, softened their hopes, taught their children to be content with crumbs, not because they lacked imagination, but because desire had become dangerous. Even love had to be rationed. How do you raise 6 children when you can barely feed 2? How do you grieve when mourning takes time you don't have? So they became efficient with affection. A hand on the shoulder, a nod across a field, a quiet lullaby without a smile. And yet they kept something, a thread of resistance, woven into the dull fabric of survival, a song hummed under the breath, a stolen moment of joy, a secret name for a baby whispered before baptism, just in case the priest's God wasn't listening. But the old gods were. They gave up much, but not everything. Because even in hunger, even in darkness, even in lives written in mud, they knew there were parts of themselves the world couldn't take, not without a fight. Home is a generous word. For the peasants near Versailles, home was not a place of comfort. It was a place of containment, a single room. Sometimes two, if fortune had smiled, though it rarely did, built from mud, straw, stone, roofed with thatch or tile scavenged from ruins, floors made of packed earth, damp in spring, frozen in winter, alive with insects in summer, inside a hearth, not decorative, essential. The hearth was the only source of heat, of cooking, of light when the sun retired early, which it often did. No chimneys, just smoke curling out through holes in the wall or under the eaves. Every wall, every rafter was blackened with soot. Your lungs were blackened too, but no one called it that. They called it coughing. They called it winter. The bed singular was shared. Parents, children, infants, and sometimes the occasional animal, especially in storms. Not for sentiment, for warmth. Clothes hung from nails, bread, if there was any, from rafters. Tools lined the walls like silent witnesses to every hour. There was no decor, no indulgence, a rosary, perhaps, a wooden crucifix. Dried herbs over the door to keep illness out, or spirits, or both. The air always smelled of smoke, sweat, and onions. You were lucky enough to have onions, and still it was home, a place to return to close a door if you had one and feel, just for a moment, unseen. It was where you washed, barely, where you bled, quietly, where you mourned, privately, when the world outside didn't have time for your grief, where you whispered to children in the dark, "No, don't be afraid, I'm here." Even if here meant shivering beside a leaking wall while rats chattered under the floor. Home was not sacred. It was not safe. But it was stitched to you as surely as your name. When someone left through marriage, through death, The house remembered. In the silence, in the way the light hit the far wall differently, in the way the air shifted, like it missed someone, because even walls made of mud can miss, and even the poorest homes are full of ghosts. Houses talk, if you live in them long enough, not in words, but in creaks, in drafts, in the way the wind hisses through a cracked shutter at 2 in the morning. Peasant homes were not sealed boxes, they breathed. Every board, every beam, every woven wall of straw and clay held stories and secrets. Conversations were never truly private. Not when your children slept 3 feet away, and the fire never quite died, and even the mice seemed to listen. So you learned to speak in codes, in glances, in gestures. A hand on the shoulder meant I forgive you. A ladle slammed too hard into a pot meant I haven't. A pause after a joke meant I'm remembering something I shouldn't. Homes were not silent, they were saturated, with memory, with routine. You woke to the same sounds each day. Rooster, wind, the rustle of someone shifting beneath a blanket that never fully covered their feet. You knew who was awake before you opened your eyes, by the scrape of boots, by the way the floorboards sighed under certain feet. And when someone was gone, the silence they left was specific. Not just absence, but a hole in the music of the morning. Children grew in these houses like weeds, wild, stubborn, resilient, their height marked in notches on the doorframe, their laughter ricocheting off the beams, their sobs tucked into corners they'd revisit later in life, wondering why they still felt sad there. Houses remembered everything, even if no one else did. A mother's song hummed while mending, a brother's cough always worse at night, the smell of lard and sorrow, and sometimes, after decades, nothing, just empty walls, an abandoned hearth, a window that looks out on nothing but memory. Historians rarely write about rooms. They write about wars, kings, treaties. But a room can be a world, and a world can hold more truth than any crown. Peasant homes were not remarkable, but they were real, and real things matter, especially when they're gone. Power in a peasant's home wasn't absolute. It shifted, it whispered, it made itself known in who stirred the pot, who set the rules, who dared to break them when the shutters were closed and the fire was low. The man was, in theory, the head of the house. But theory, like warmth, did not always reach the corners. In practice, it was the mother who governed, not loudly, not with speeches, but with the quiet, relentless authority of someone who remembered where everything was bred. Birth, rags, old wounds, secrets. She knew which child would wake coughing, which neighbor couldn't be trusted with a borrowed ladle, which silence meant sulking and which meant sorrow. She rationed food, managed tempers, patched clothes, and brokered peace. She was not romanticized. She was not often thanked. She was simply essential. The domestic sphere was not a refuge. It was another form of labor. But it was also the only realm where a peasant woman could exercise control. The men left to plow, to bargain, to be humiliated by tax collectors. The women stayed and made order from nothing. They knew how to stretch a pot of soup across 3 days, how to quiet a baby with an old sock filled with herbs, how to clean blood from sheets and pretend the tears on their face were from chopping onions. And sometimes, when things got too hard, when hunger a bit too deep, or grief sank to loathe, they argued, loudly, publicly, because holding it in would have meant imploding. Neighbors would hear, would shake their heads, would say, well, they've had a hard year, and then go back to their own simmering pot of unspoken things. There were no therapists. There was bread. And, When that failed, there was cider. And after the storm, they would sit beside each other at the same hearth. Not because it was resolved, but because life had to go on. The fire still needed tending. The animals still needed feeding. The children still needed lullabies. This was the parliament of the home, not of law, but of endurance. Everyone had a vote, whether they spoke it or not, and everyone lived with the consequences. Quiet power, soft resilience, decisions made with hands deep in dough. History doesn't list their names, but if you could read the walls, you'd find them. Written not in ink, but in wear, in care, in survival. To modern eyes, the peasant home looks like a cage. No glass in the windows, just wooden shutters. No locks on the door, just latches, made of bone or bent iron. No privacy ever. But to the people inside, it was more like a skin, something you wore, something that fit you, poorly perhaps, but well enough to keep out the worst of the wind. The shutters let in air, and smoke, and voices. Your neighbor's argument, a donkey braying, the far-off clang of church bells marking yet another hour you couldn't afford to waste. Children played at the threshold, half in, half out, too muddy to bring inside, too cold to leave unattended. They were the only curtains that moved with the season. Wood in winter, nothing in summer, and in autumn just enough to keep the rain from licking the floor into mud again. At night, the world pressed in. Wolves howled in the distance, not metaphorically but literally. Owls blinked from thatched rafters, and sometimes a figure would pass the window, a silhouette known only by the limp, or the hat, or the fear it left behind. You couldn't close the world out completely, so you didn't try. Instead, you adapted. Stories filled the gaps. You taught your children to listen, not just to the wolves, but to what the wind meant, to the difference between normal creaking and a bad omen. You learned to read weather in the chimney smoke, to predict grief in the way a candle refused to light. It wasn't superstition, it was wisdom born of porous living. Life didn't happen outside your house, it happened through it, with it. When a neighbor fell ill, you didn't wait for a knock, you heard the silence. When a baby was born, you didn't need to be told. You smelled the boiling cloth, the blood, the fear. Homes weren't boundaries, they were membranes, and the world passed in and out, in whispers, in drafts, in sorrow. There's something strangely holy in that. A life lived not behind walls, but within them. Not shut away from the world, but weathered by it, and somehow still standing, like shutters that never quite close, but still keep the worst of the storm at bay. In a world without central heat, without switches or stoves, the hearth was not just part of the home, it was the home. It was the first thing lit in the morning, the last thing checked at night, and in the deepest winters, the only thing between survival and something colder. Peasant fires were not large. They were not cheerful flames licking logs in picturesque dance. They were smouldering embers, carefully preserved under ash, fed just enough to stay alive. Fuel was precious. Wood meant labor. Someone, often a child, had to rise before dawn, break the ice on the bucket, trudge to the tree line, and return with arms full of frostbitten sticks. Sometimes they burned dung, sometimes straw, sometimes whatever had fallen from the landlord's trees without notice. Smoke filled the room, not by mistake, by design. It kept the bugs away, dried the thatch, and sometimes, they believed, kept the spirits in their place. The fire cooked everything: bread, stew, the rare slab of meat, its scent turning the whole village's head. It heated the washwater, warmed newborns, smoked fish strung from rafters, turning grey with salt and hope. It also punished. Burns were common. Children wandered too close. Clothes caught. Ashes were swept. Swept again, never quite gone. Still, the hearth was sacred. More sacred than church. It held the stories, the sighs, the murmurs shared between spoonfuls. When the fire went out, people grew quiet. It meant something, that someone had forgotten. That death might be near. That protection had slipped. In some villages, the hearth fire was never allowed to die completely. It was passed, ember to ember, from mother to daughter. It was stolen if it had to be, borrowed in clay pots, carried across fields, glowing like a secret between women who knew what it meant to keep a family warm. Even in revolution, when palaces burned and kings fell, peasants still protected their fires. Because kings come and go, but the hearth stays. And as long as it glowed, dim as it may be, there was life, there was soup, there was story, there was a home. In Versailles, children were painted chubby, powdered, adorned in lace. They were tokens, symbols, accessories in miniature. In the villages beyond the palace, children were tools. Born with soft skin but hard futures, they were not allowed to stay children for long. If they cried, it was rarely in luxury. If they played, it was in dirt. And if they survived infancy, which many did not, they were given a task. As soon as they could stand, they were put to work, fetching, carrying, holding, watching. You might see a boy no taller than a sack of flour, leading a goat twice his size through a frost-bitten path, or a girl no older than 6 crouched by the river, pounding linen into wet stones, her fingers already red and raw. Their games were not toys. They were training, a pretend cradle for a younger sibling, a pretend oven made of rocks and ash, a pretend field with imaginary crops and real mud beneath their feet. They did not go to school, not in the way you imagine it. If they learned to read, it was from a priest. If they learned numbers, it was from counting eggs. If they learned morality, it was from watching what happened to people who didn't pay their dues. Still, they learned fast, not because they were bright, because they had to. In villages where life hung by a thread, children became apprentices to survival. They learned to lie when the tax collector came. They learned which roots to dig and which berries to avoid. They learned how to mend shoes before they grew into them. And yet there was wonder, even in mud, even in hunger. Laughter still echoed. Children still raced, barefoot and shrieking, through the fields. They still whispered secrets in haylofts and tried to steal sugar from the pantry. Their joys were brief, often punished, and always precious. A single apple, a ribbon found in the road, a story told by a grandmother who remembered a time before this one. They were not innocent, but they were alive. And in a world that demanded too much, too soon, that alone was a miracle. There was a language children learned young in the villages around Versailles, not French, not Latin, but silence. It came in glances, in the tightening of a mother's jaw when the taxman rode past, in the way grown-ups lowered their voices when speaking of missing grain, or dead livestock, or worse, missing neighbors. Children understood early that certain things were not to be asked. Where the bread went, why there were fewer potatoes this year, why uncle no longer spoke since the corvée took him away. Instead, they watched, and from that watching they inherited a kind of wisdom, heavy, wordless, hard to carry. They learned how to slip between adult anxieties without disturbing them, how to pretend to sleep when the firelight flickered with whispered fears, how to tiptoe past grief like it was something you could wake. Boys learned to mimic their fathers, stoic, slow-moving, grim, Girls learned to anticipate the next task before being asked. No one had to teach them. They breathed it. And for the children who dared to speak, to question, punishment was not always harsh. Sometimes it was worse. A long look, a refusal to answer, a sudden stillness in a room that had once been moving. They weren't silenced by violence, they were silenced by necessity, because explaining the world to a child required hope, and hope was in short supply. Instead, they passed down silence, as a skill, as a shield, as a form of protection that looked a lot like abandonment. And when those children grew up, they carried that silence forward, spoke in the same half-truths, held their own children the same way their mothers had, tightly but distractedly, as if love was a hand always reaching for something else. There were moments of softness, a lullaby, a joke, a dance when the harvest was good. But beneath it all, the silence waited, inherited, enduring, unspoken. And in that silence, a history lived, not written in books, not carved in stone, but pressed into the skin of every child who grew up too soon and never quite forgot what it felt like to ask a question and hear only the wind. Even in the muddiest corners of peasant life, children played. It wasn't joyless, but it wasn't carefree either. Their games had edges shaped by labor, softened by repetition, sharpened by hunger. A favorite, the stick game. Each child found a stick. The longest one won. No prizes, just pride. Sometimes it turned into swordplay, sometimes into arguments, always into something that ended with someone crying, someone laughing, and someone walking away with a scratched cheek and no apology. They played tag, of course chasing each other between cabbage patches, over frozen puddles, past barns that smelled like sleep and sour milk. But they also played at work. Little girls washed pebbles in buckets. Little boys built tiny fences from twigs. They practiced, without knowing, the shape their lives would take. Imitation wasn't just flattery, it was training. Some made dolls from cloth scraps. No eyes, no names, just something to hold while pretending not to notice the rats. Others kept rocks as pets, carved symbols into tree bark and called them magic, believed the creek held secrets. And maybe it did. They had no toys, but they had tools. An imagination made anything bend. An old spoon became a knight's sword, a broken broom, a horse. They played death, too. A child would lie still, eyes closed. The others would weep dramatically, then laugh. No one had to explain the rules. They knew, because real funerals weren't rare. They followed them down the path, sometimes barefoot, sometimes holding their mother's hand and not daring to cry. So when they played death, they were practicing grief, or mocking it, or simply trying to make sense of a thing no one explained. There was singing, too, rhymes passed down like spells. Most made no sense, but the sound mattered. It filled the space between chores and cold, between now and tomorrow. Sometimes the older ones didn't play at all. They watched, too tired, too aware. They stood at the edge of the game, arms folded, already becoming someone else. A worker, a father, a girl with hands too swollen to clap. And that was the tragedy and the triumph. That even with everything, they still played. With sticks, with stones, with grief. With everything they didn't have words for yet, because childhood wasn't given. It was taken, stolen, claimed, in moments that passed too quickly but were real while they lasted. The village had no blackboards, no desks, no bells to ring, but the children were taught, not by curriculum, by necessity, by field and fire and the rhythm of survival. Their education began with watching, a mother's hands knotting string, a father's silence, meaning not now, the shape of frost creeping across the window before the potatoes ran out. Lessons came disguised, in the sound of a cow in labor, in the pattern of moss that meant north, in the weight of a bucket pulled too fast from a well. You learned not from books, but from bodies, bent backs, missing fingers, lips that moved even when no one was listening. If there was a priest, he might teach the letters. Not so you could write poetry, but so you could read scripture, or the fine print on a tax notice. Most girls weren't taught at all. What did a girl need with reading when her hands were needed to knead and mend? Still, some learned in secret. A brother's discarded scraps, a whisper from an older cousin, a borrowed page tucked into the folds of a dress. The village's alphabet wasn't 26 letters, it was 100 gestures. A nod meant I'll help. A look meant don't speak. A turned back was its own kind of sentence. They were fluent in silence and repetition. Every task became a lesson. Chop the wood, boil the water. Watch for the boil to change its rhythm. That's how you know when it's safe. And sometimes there were stories, told at night, by firelight, half true, half warning, of a boy who wandered too far into the woods, of a girl who spoke to a fox and never returned, of a giant who slept beneath the hills and would wake if you stole his wheat. These were not fairy tales. They were memory storage, emotional instruction manuals, because what better way to teach a child caution than to dress it in a riddle? They didn't graduate. There were no diplomas, only skill and scars. And if they lived long enough, they passed it on, not as lectures, but as gestures, hands guiding hands, a kind of legacy without paper, and a kind of learning that survived long after the words were forgotten. Some children didn't make it. Most villagers didn't speak of them often. There were too many, and grief, when constant, becomes a kind of fog, something you learn to breathe through. They were buried quietly, in churchyards, if space allowed, in corners of fields, if it didn't, sometimes with a wooden cross, sometimes not at all. No headstone, just earth, packed slightly uneven, a name remembered by a mother who would never say it aloud again. Infant mortality was not a tragedy, it was an expectation. 1 in 3, sometimes more, fevers, coughs, a fall, a winter too long, a birth too hard, and then nothing, a baby one day, an absence the next. Some mothers kept the swaddling cloths, folded them tightly, put them in drawers, touched them in the dark, when no one could see. Others threw them in the fire, watched the threads curl, and told themselves the child had never existed, because it was easier than remembering the sound of a cry that would never return. Fathers grieved differently, or they didn't. Or they did, but quietly, by working longer, drinking more, standing outside after dusk, staring at nothing. Siblings felt it too, though they lacked the words. One day a baby to hold, to giggle at, to poke with curious fingers, and then silence. A blanket folded too neatly, a corner of the room that smelled like ash. There were no grief counselors, only neighbors who said, God's will, or worse, better this way, not cruelly, just, tiredly, because everyone had lost someone. There was no fresh grief, only recycled grief, worn thin, passed down, and still they kept having children, not from hope, from rhythm, from expectation, from the deep, stubborn instinct that life must go on, even when it doesn't make sense, because sometimes one child survived, and then another, and in that survival, something sparkled again, not happiness, but possibility, and so the cycle continued. Love, loss, labor, lullabies that knew too much. Blankets passed from child to child, some never used, but always kept. Because even in a world where most children didn't grow up, the ones who did carried everything. Winter for the peasant was not a season, it was a verdict. All year long, you prepared for it. You dried beans, you salted pork, you stacked wood until your fingers cracked and your back screamed. And still, it was never enough, because winter did not care how hard you had worked. It arrived like a tax collector cold, unavoidable, unsmiling. The ground froze, the well thickened with ice, and the wind turned the walls of your home into something ornamental. You slept with your boots near the fire, not out of order, but because they might freeze solid overnight. You huddled together, you ate less, you spoke less. There was no light after dusk. Candles were hoarded like relics. One flame, shared by 5 people, casting shadows that danced like specters across the rafters. The body slowed. Everything took longer. Pulling water, boiling soup, gathering enough courage to go outside. Illness came easily. A cough could linger all season. Fevers burned through families like gossip, and the old died. Not dramatically, just quietly. One morning, they didn't wake, or they went to sleep by the hearth and slipped into stillness before the stew was warm. Death was not announced. It was folded into routine. You'd see the priest walking faster. You'd hear the extra toll of the bell, and someone would start boiling linen in the next house over. Children learned to keep warm by movement, by chores, by clinging to animals who didn't mind the weight. The goats were warmer than people. The dog knew how to sleep curled into your back like a second heart. And yet, there were moments, frost on a window pane, etched like lace, the crunch of untouched snow beneath your heel, a song sung to chase the dark, caught and carried through still branches like a benediction. Peasants did not romanticize winter, but they recognized its honesty. It did not pretend. It did not flatter. It revealed who had prepared and who had no one left to prepare for, and somehow they made it through. Not every time, but enough times to try again. And that, perhaps, is the purest definition of hope. Spring arrived like an apology. After months of bone-deep cold, of coughs and silence, and the rustle of death moving from door to door, spring crept in with mud and the smell of wet things. It didn't burst, it seeped. The snow didn't vanish, it rotted, darkened into slush that sank into the earth, into your shoes, into your bones. But there were signs. A bud here, a bird there. The first green shoots poking up in the ditch, so fragile you almost didn't trust them. And yet, trust them you must, because spring meant food. Eventually, if the weather held, if the seeds took, if the hail stayed away, it also meant labor, back-breaking, ankle-deep, muscle-ripping work, turning soil that had slept like a corpse, sowing by hand, the seed slipping through cold fingers that still bore the cracks of winter. No machines, no beasts of burden for many. Just the endless arc of the back and the quiet curse of damp wool. It was dirty, hungry work, because spring was still the suit of the lean season. Last year's stores had dwindled, grown mold, been eaten by rats or men, and this year's harvest was still only a dream. So you worked while hungry, while dizzy, while your children watched you, asking if the garden meant bread tomorrow, and you said yes, even though you didn't know. Rain came too often, or not at all. The sun returned like a drunken friend, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, and every good day felt like a wager. A late frost could kill everything. One bad week, and you were back to scraping the mold off your memory of a meal. Still, you hoped, because that was what spring demanded: the gamble, the digging, the long, slow act of faith in a world that had never promised to be kind. You planted anyway, not because you believed it would work, but because not planting wasn't an option. And when the fields finally began to color, a flush of green against the wet brown, somewhere someone sang, just for a moment, just softly, a hum maybe. Because even if spring lied, it was a beautiful lie. And beauty, for a peasant, was reason enough to keep going. Summer, in the peasant's year, was not leisure, it was siege. The days were long, yes, but they were long with heat, with flies, with the relentless hum of labor that would not end. You rose before the sun, because the sun was cruel. It punished those who lingered. Field work began in dew and ended in dust. The air shimmered with sweat and pollen and the distant threat of thunder. Everything had to be done at once. Weeding, repairing fences, tending animals, harvesting the early crops, lettuce, peas, those delicate things that could spoil if left too long. The wheat, not yet ready, grew tall and stubborn. Its golden promise swayed in the wind, tempting fate. Children were pressed into service, not metaphorically, literally. They chased crows. They fetched water from springs that barely trickled. They carried baskets heavier than they were. There were no holidays, only feast days that required even more work. Slaughtering, baking, carrying the best of what you had to the church or your neighbor's table. Knowing you might go without tomorrow, you sweated through your only shirt. You itched from sunburn and insect bites and the constant chafing of dirt in places dirt shouldn't be. And still, you worked, because summer was the test. If you failed, winter would kill you. If you passed, well, winter might still kill you. But at least you'd made the attempt. Evenings were not restful. They were full of mending, of patching roofs that sagged, of trying to coax seeds into pots on the windowsill for late harvest. The animals needed checking. The tools needed sharpening. The blister on your heel needed draining again, and sleep. Sleep came like a thief, stealing a few hours while your body screamed beneath its own weight. Dreams, when they happened, were strange, not of escape, but of small things: cool water, unbroken eggs, a day with clouds. Because peasants did not dream of luxury, they dreamed of less pain. And still there were moments: a plum warm from the sun, a child laughing at a chicken, the breeze before a storm call, sudden, almost holy. These were not rewards, they were reminders that you were still alive, and in summer that had to be enough. Autumn, in the villages beyond Versailles, was both harvest and hunger, a contradiction in golden light. To outsiders, it looked like abundance: carts full of grain, barrels brimming with cider, smoke curling from chimneys, fragrant with meat and wood. But for peasants, autumn was an inventory, a reckoning, a whispered question: is it enough? The wheat was cut by hand, sickle to stalk. One wrong step, one twisted ankle, and you lost a day. Lose too many days, and you lost the winter. Harvests were collective. Entire families in the fields back, bent, fingers raw, shirts stuck to spines with sweat and dirt. And when the grain was finally in, it had to be threshed, winnowed, stored. Each step risked disaster. A sudden rain could rot the sheaves. A careless child could tear a sack. A rat could undo what a month of labor built. The taxman came early. He always knew when the granary was full. His boots left cleaner prints than yours. You gave what was required, sometimes more, because arguing cost more than bread. Then came the slaughter. Autumn was when animals died, not sentimentally, logistically. The pigs too small to fatten, the chickens who stopped laying, the cow whose milk turned sour. Knives were sharpened, blood flowed into gutters. Children watched some with fascination, some with fear. Nothing was wasted. Bones became broth, skins became patches, fat became candles, and then the food was preserved. Smoked, salted, buried in cellars that smelled of stone and silence. The joy was cautious. Yes, there was cider. Yes, there was bread thicker than usual, sweeter than the rest of the year. Yes, there was dancing. But behind every smile was the same question: will it last? Because winter always asked more than you expected, and autumn never answered. So you celebrated with one foot on the brake. You raised your glass, knowing it might be the last for a while. You sang softly, as if not to wake some sleeping misfortune. Autumn was not a finish line. It was the thin edge of a cliff, beautiful, blinding, and behind it called for the peasants of Versailles shadow. Time was not progress. It was pattern. There were no clocks, no calendars hanging neatly on a wall. Time came from the sun, the soil, the weight of your own body bending in repetition. Monday meant washing, Tuesday meant mending, Wednesday was for weeding unless it rained. If it rained, you shifted everything like you always did, like your grandmother had taught you. There were no weekends, only feast days, and even those came with obligations: mass, baking, enduring the cheerful cruelty of more fortunate neighbors. Each month had its mood. January was hard, February was harder, March was mud, April led, May teased, June demanded, July punished, August bled you dry, September begged you to believe, October warned, November mourned, and December was waiting. The seasons weren't poetic. They were cycles of hunger, hope, exhaustion. They were the frame through which you viewed your own insignificance, and yet they gave structure, a kind of rhythm to pain, a scaffold for joy. When the first frost came, you remembered the last one. When the wheat rose, you remembered the year it didn't. When your child asked, "Why do we do this?" you didn't say tradition. You said, "Because it's time." There were no fresh starts, no clean slates, only another loop. But there was something comforting in that, in knowing the days would repeat, that the sky would turn the same color again, that you had survived this season before and might survive it again, not because you were strong, but because your ancestors had. Time wasn't a ladder, it was a wheel, and you didn't climb it. You held on and spun and tried not to let go. It's a strange thing to pay for something you will never touch. Stranger still when that thing is a palace. Versailles distant, gilded, sacred loomed, large in the mind of every French peasant. Not because they had seen it, most never did, but because they were financing it, brick by brick, mirror by mirror, curtain by absurdly expensive curtain, through their sweat, through their grain, through the chickens they handed over to the taxman while their own stew pot sat empty. The taxes were endless, and they were elastic. They stretched to absorb whatever new vanity the court required. A new fountain that would be more tale, salt for your bread, only after the gabble took its share. You paid to use the mill, paid to bake your bread, paid to walk the road your feet had worn into the dirt. And if you didn't pay, they came for your tools, your animals, your children. Your children were sometimes taken to settle a debt, to serve in a house far away, to disappear into the machinery of someone else's comfort. There was no mercy, only a schedule. The taxman arrived when he pleased. He did not knock. He did not smile. He did not care about your sick wife, or your bad harvest, or the mice who had eaten half your hope. You paid, or you paid later, and later was worse. Sometimes you tried to hide things, a sack of grain buried in the woods. A pig moved to your cousin's farm, but word traveled faster than fire. And when you were caught, the punishment was not creative, just efficient. A fine you couldn't afford, or your name written down somewhere official, somewhere dangerous. A peasant's name was safest unwritten. The king never knew your face, but your face helped warm his bathwater, fed his horses, lit his hall. You gave him everything, and all you got in return was silence. If the tail stole your harvest, and the gabble stole your salt, the corvée stole the one thing you could never replace, your time. The corvée was a labor tax. You owed the king not just in grain or coin, but in days. Days away from your field. Days your family worked without you. Days you spent repairing roads, building ditches, lifting stones for projects that had nothing to do with your life or your death. It was unpaid, mandatory, and deeply resented. You might be summoned during planting season or harvest, or right after your wife gave birth. There was no schedule, only a notice, nailed to a post or whispered by a local official with his hat in his hands and guilt in his eyes. Next week, he'd say, "They're calling your name." You'd leave before dawn, walk miles to a work site. They'd hand you a spade, or a cart, or a pickaxe, and you'd do as told. Shoulders burning, knees buckling, thinking only of the weeds growing unchecked in your own fields. No one cared if your house was falling apart. No one asked if your cow had died. You were now part of the machine, and machines do not rest. If you protested, quietly, gently, even reasonably, you might be fined, or watched, or worse, remembered. And to be remembered by the wrong person was dangerous. Some bribed their way out of the corvée, but that required money, and money belonged to people who did not know what a blister was. So you went, and came back broken, and started again, because the land didn't care that you'd been gone. It still needed you, and so did your family. No one thanked you. There were no medals, no memorials, only blessings and bitterness, and the memory of a ditch you helped dig for a king who would never set foot in your village. And yet somehow you kept going, because even your time wasn't really yours. Not in that world, not in that century, not with a palace that glittered while you bent. There was no end to what could be taxed. You could be taxed for the land you didn't own, for the roof that leaked, for the goat that hadn't given milk in weeks, for the salt you never tasted, but were required to purchase anyway. You could be taxed while sick, while dying, while grieving. Even the dead weren't free. When someone passed, the family still owed a fee to bury, a tithe for the soul, a cut for the priest, the gravedigger, the lord. And if you couldn't pay, the funeral was shorter, the prayers thinner, the memory of your loved one somehow smaller. Babies could be taxed before they were born. A midwife's service cost coin. A baptismal offering was expected. The church and the state stood together, hands outstretched. One offered heaven, the other offered hunger, and you, caught between them, gave everything. Some peasants kept 2 books in their heads, one for what they owed, one for what they couldn't pay. The second book was heavier. It included favors promised, debts postponed, apologies to children too young to understand why dinner was water and bread again. Sometimes you bartered a chicken for a late fee, wool for a blessing, a day of labor for a piece of parchment declaring that, for now, you were in good standing. But standing meant nothing if you couldn't walk. And many couldn't. Their legs swollen, their backs twisted, their hopes sapped by years of giving more than they ever had. Still, they complied, because rebellion meant ruin, because the king was far, but the local collector was not. And when the collector smiled, it never reached his eyes. He was just another man doing a job. He had a family too, and he, too, feared the people above him more than the people in front of him. So you paid with grain, with time, with the names of your neighbors who might still have a hen to spare. And when the tax was met, and the collector's cart rolled away, you sat by the hearth, cold and quiet, and whispered to no one, "What more can they take?" The silence answered back, "Wait." Peasants were told they owed the king their lives. Not in a poetic sense, in the contractual sense, born subjects, bound by blood. God had placed them there, and to question the king was to question God himself. That was the line, anyway. But the truth sat elsewhere. It curled at the edge of every whispered complaint. It glinted in every lowered voice when someone said the king's name and then spit. They weren't loyal, not really. Not in the way Versailles imagined. They were tired. Tired people don't rebel. Not because they believe, but because they don't have the energy to stop believing. So they wore their loyalty like a coat 2 sizes too small. Tight, uncomfortable, sometimes borrowed just to survive winter. The priests spoke of divine order, the nobles spoke of duty, the officials spoke of gratitude. But gratitude for what? For being spared starvation, for a winter slightly less cruel than the one before, for the privilege of handing your firstborn to the levee. And yet they nodded, they bowed, they played along, because pretending was safer than defiance. Because silence fed your children more effectively than courage. And still, sometimes the mask slipped. A laugh, too sharp. A muttered curse in the fields. A refusal to toast the king's health, even when the wine was free. There were small acts, invisible rebellions. Planting a row of beans too close to the Lord's fence. Skipping mass. Naming your child something unapproved. Something ancestral, something wild. These were not revolutions, but they were cracks. And cracks spread. Because when you live beneath a lie long enough, your back begins to bend, and one day it doesn't bend anymore. One day it breaks. That day was not yet here, but it was coming, rising like heat under the skin. Pacing like a wolf at the edge of a village too poor to own a gate. And the king, in his palace of mirrors, never heard it. But the peasants did. They had been hearing it for years. You don't start a revolution because of ideas. You start one because your child is crying and there's no bread. And bread, for the French peasant, was everything. So when it vanished, when the baker's shelves were empty, or worse, when they were full but guarded, the people moved. Quietly, at first, then not. Women led the charge more often than not, because they were the ones who felt hunger directly, intimately, who measured it in teaspoons and lullabies. They gathered in the marketplace, clenched fists around stones, did not wait for permission. They stormed bakeries. They took what they needed. Sometimes they left coins, sometimes they didn't. because justice doesn't always wear a receipt. Words spread like fire faster, even from village to village, from whisper to wall, that someone, somewhere, had stood up. And in that knowledge, power, not the power of armies, but of bodies, of boots on dirt roads, of hands that knew how to dig and build and tear down. The officials panicked. Troops were summoned, bayonets drawn. But you cannot scare a person who's already watched their child die, who's already buried hope. You can only delay them. And the king still danced, still dressed, still dined on cream, while the cream curdled in his people's hearts. But the peasants remembered every tax, every cartload of grain that left their village for someone else's feast, every moment of silence where there should have been mercy, and what had once been complaint became conviction. They didn't speak of liberty. Not yet. They spoke of fairness, of bread, of being seen, and slowly, terribly, beautifully, they began to believe something new, that the world might change, not by decree, but by demand, not in the name of kings, but in the name of those who had nothing left to give, except their rage. Revolution never starts with a bang. It starts with a whisper. And in the villages beyond Versailles, the whisper was spreading. It drifted in through churchyards, passed over fields, sat heavy in alehouses. A low murmur. Did you hear what happened in Paris? Someone spoke out. Someone refused. Someone broke a lock, tore a notice down, shouted in the square that bread should not cost a life. And just like that, the impossible began to feel inevitable, because the hunger hadn't changed. The taxes hadn't softened. The king hadn't noticed. But the people were beginning to notice each other. That was new. The blacksmith, who never spoke. The widow, who counted each coin out loud as though it might change the total. The boy who ran messages between villages because no one stopped a child. They were all saying it now. Different words, same meaning, enough. Enough carrying the world while others polished it. Enough bleeding in silence. Enough waiting for a kindness that never came. Not everyone joined. Some still feared. Feared the soldiers. Feared God. Feared what would happen if the wheel turned too far and crushed them instead of lifting them. But fear no longer held everyone, and courage, once ignited, is hard to smother. It caught like dry straw. A speech in one town led to a march in another. A stolen ledger became a symbol. A loaf shared became a promise. The nobles called it noise. The church called it unrest. The court, if it heard anything at all, called it nothing worth worrying about. But in the taverns and the lanes, under the full moon and the empty bellies, something had shifted. The people had always known how to suffer. Now they were learning how to speak. And in those words, quiet, fractured, hopeful, was the seed of a storm. It began with small things. A cart overturned. A tax office shuttered and mysteriously burned. A landlord's ledger tossed into a well. Not war, not yet. Just the slow uncoiling of restraint. Because something had snapped. Not loudly, not all at once. Like a tree that finally gives under years of wind. The fields still needed tending. The animals still needed feeding. But now, those same hands that had sown and milked and carried were clenched. Peasants didn't wear uniforms. They wore dust. And when they rose together, not with songs of glory, but with lists of what had been taken, of what had been promised, of what they would no longer endure. They didn't ask for Versailles. They asked for fairness. And then, when fairness was mocked, they stopped asking. Manners were looted. Records were burned. Symbolic things, coats of arms, velvet chairs, silk bedding, were dragged into the street and set alight. It wasn't greed, it was grief with kindling. And the fire wasn't just in the barns, it was in the mind. For the first time in generations, a peasant might look a noble in the eye, and not look away. Mothers told their children bedtime stories, where the villain wore lace. Old men sharpened tools that were no longer just for ploughing. And somewhere, beneath all this motion, beneath the slogans, the shouting, the cracked doors and nervous soldiers, was an ancient truth. They had been lied to for centuries, told they were small, told they were lucky, told to bow. Now they stood, and found themselves taller than expected. The palace still gleamed, but it gleamed in fear, because no amount of gold can outshine 1,000 people realizing, together, that they were never as powerless as they'd been told. It didn't start with thunder. No storm rolled in from the heavens. No blood-red sky warned the powerful. It was a summer day like any other, dry dust in the throat, sweat pooling behind the knees, the kind of day that made you feel slow and forgettable. But something was different. In one village, a man stood on a cart and read aloud from a paper. His voice was cracked, not from age but from disbelief. It was a declaration scribbled in another town, another dialect, but its meaning was clear enough. We are not beasts. We are not children. We are not property. People gathered, not many, but more than usual. Women stood with arms folded, babies on hips. Old men leaned on their sticks, eyes narrowed. Children lingered, sensing the change in the air. It didn't matter if the paper was true. What mattered was that it said something they'd been feeling for years. They didn't clap, they didn't cheer. They simply listened. And once you've really listened, once a part of you opens to an idea you were told was too big for you, you don't close again. In another village, someone refused to hand over their grain. Not all of it, just a sack, the collector insisted. The man said no. The collector laughed until the others stepped forward. Not violently, not even with words, just presence. And suddenly, the collector stopped laughing. It spread from town to town, not like fire, but like frost, creeping, changing the shape of things, killing what had once been green and beautiful only to those who never tilled it. Some peasants still hesitated. They remembered the last time someone raised their voice and lost everything. They remembered the wheel, the rope, the cold cell where no one came to ask why. But memory isn't just a weight, it's a guide. And what they remembered more than punishment was the silence that followed. How nothing changed. How grief settled over the fields like fog. How they swallowed their rage and called it patience. Now they had another name for it, lies. The king still held his court, still danced, still dined, still stepped carefully around the idea of consequences. He sent letters, decrees, warnings, but parchment could not plug a well once it had cracked. And this well had been cracked for generations. Villagers began to form councils, nothing official, nothing regal. Just men and women gathering to say, what will we do if they come with guns? What will we do if they come at all? And when no one came, when no one stopped them, they did something they'd never done before. They imagined not just survival, not just less suffering, but something else. Something they had no word for. Something like fairness, like voice, like a life that wasn't just a slow death with chores. They didn't all call it revolution. Some called it justice. Others called it hunger with teeth. But they all knew it felt different, like a long breath held finally released, like a road that no longer curved back into itself. Somewhere in the distance, The bells of Versailles still rang, but they sounded tinny now, because the peasants had their own music. The rustle of papers passed hand to hand, the murmur of voices not waiting for permission, the shuffle of boots toward a city they had never been allowed to enter, and the wind, that old peasant god, shifted. It blew not toward the palace, but through it. The curtains trembled, the mirrors fogged, and in the distance, faint but growing, 1,000 voices rose, low and human and indivisible. Enough. Versailles stood untouched. At first, its gardens still bloomed with unnatural perfection. Its marble floors echoed only with the soft tap of embroidered shoes. Its mirrors, thousands of them, reflected nothing but themselves. Inside, there was no famine, only fashion. A new dress for the queen, a new painting for the hall, a new menu prepared for a dinner that would take 4 hours and satisfy no hunger. They dined by candlelight bright enough to burn a village. They spoke of taxes as numbers, not lives. They spoke of the people as shadows, fickle, faceless, faintly annoying. No one believed it could fall. After all, it had been built to last forever. But forever is fragile when built on suffering. And the palace had been built on everything the peasants no longer wanted to give. What the court did not understand, could not understand, was that fear had shifted sides. Once, the peasant feared the noble. Now, the noble feared the crowd, and the crowd had learned to move. From village to village, from rumor to rally, from whispered complaint to shouted demand. Inside the palace, some still believed in the old order, that God had chosen them, that tradition was armor, that mirrors told the truth. But outside, the truth wore no lace. It was barefoot, it was tired, and it was walking slowly, steadily toward the gates. Some servants had already left, vanished in the night, not out of disloyalty, but realism, because even they, half invisible as they work, could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. There were tremors in the hallways, not earthquakes. People, servants pausing too long, guards with eyes cast downward, the kitchen girls speaking too freely. The king noticed, but he misunderstood. He believed they were afraid for him. They were afraid of him, and not in the way he needed them to be. And still, he danced, held court, signed papers with a hand grown soft from lack of labor. And outside, the people didn't wait for an invitation. They marched, not in columns, not with banners, just with hunger and memory and each other. Versailles could not understand them. It had spent too long looking at its own reflection. It forgot that reflections are quiet. People are not. They do not knock forever. Sometimes they enter. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. History, despite the myths, doesn't turn on a single scream or gunshot or act of divine lightning. It turns in silence first, in the early morning fog, in the sound of feet gathering on dirt roads, too many to be casual, in the way birds go quiet before something they don't understand. Versailles still slept. The kitchen fires had not yet been lit. The gardeners had not yet appeared with their shears to trim trees into shapes no tree should resemble. The queen had not yet chosen her dress. But beyond the hedgerows, beyond the woods, beyond the marble and myth, the people had begun to arrive. They came without banners, without horses, without songs, but they came from towns that Versailles didn't know existed, from villages that had never once been marked on royal maps, from doorways where children died last winter and no one wrote it down. They carried nothing, or nearly nothing. A tool, a pot, a child on a hip, a crust of bread hidden in a pocket, not out of strategy, but out of habit. They were not soldiers, They were not politicians. They were not men who had studied law, or women who had read the classics. They were peasants, and they had walked for days. Some barefoot, some bleeding, some old enough to know this might end badly, but not old enough to stay behind. And as they walked, the air changed. It thickened, like it knew. The guards at the outer gate boys, really, too young to have beards, too proud to ask questions, watched them come, then looked at each other, then said nothing, because no one had told them what to do if the enemy didn't carry weapons, if the enemy looked like their cousins, if the enemy was cold and tired and crying while still walking forward. The gates didn't fall. They opened, whether by command or confusion, no one is sure. But the iron swung wide on its ancient hinges, and the people entered, not as conquerors, not yet, but as witnesses. They stepped into Versailles like pilgrims entering a temple built to a god they had never been allowed to worship. They touched the stone. They looked up at ceilings so high they seemed to mock the sky. They saw mirrors taller than their homes, and walls gilded with a gold that could have bought a year's grain for an entire province. And they did not weep. They did not cheer. They stared. Because to see how the other half lives is one kind of revelation. But to see how the other half wastes, that's something else entirely. A woman stepped into the hall of mirrors, still streaked with dust from the road. She saw her reflection repeated 1,000 times and did not recognize herself, because no one had ever told her she deserved to be reflected. A man touched the velvet lining on a banquet chair and laughed softly, bitterly, like a man who'd slept on straw every night of his life. A child asked if this was a church, because it looked like one, and in a way it was. A church to excess, to distance, to forgetting. Then someone found the larder. It was full, over full. Meat hung from hooks, untouched. Wine in bottles so old, the labels peeled like autumn leaves. Loaves of white bread, real white bread, stacked like bricks. And that's when something broke. Not in the palace, in the people. Because you can suffer for decades. You can bury your child, your mother, your hope. You can give everything, even when you have nothing. But when you see the feast they've kept for themselves, the one they built from your hunger, something in you changes forever. There was no leader, no trumpet, just movement. The bread was taken. The wine poured into jugs, or down throats, or onto the floor. The meat carved with hands that had never held a silver knife. And still no violence. Not yet. Just the quiet roar of realization that the palace had never been strong, only far away. That the king had never been a god, only guarded. That they were never meant to see this place, because if they had, they would never have stayed quiet. The mirrors didn't shatter, but the illusion did. And when the sun rose over Versailles that morning, it didn't rise on a palace, it rose on a reckoning. The people were no longer outside, and the world would not turn back. There was no bell to mark the end, no trumpet, no flare in the sky, no voice crying out, "It's done." Endings rarely come with ceremony. They come with silence. After the storm of feet, of voices, of hunger turned into motion, Versailles stood still. It didn't burn, not yet. The people didn't want ash, they wanted to see. They wandered the halls like ghosts returning to a house that had forgotten them. Some sat in gilded chairs just to feel the shape of leisure. Others whispered to each other, afraid their voices might echo too loudly off the painted ceilings. They touched the things that had never been touched. A curtain, a tapestry, a pearl-handled brush. The king had fled, or was hiding, or was simply still asleep in a bed the size of a room. It didn't matter, because a crown does not fall in public. It falls in the space between moments, in a hallway, in a whisper, in the eyes of a child who sees a chandelier for the first time and says, "Why?" That was the sound. Not shattering glass, not gunfire, just a question that could not be unasked. Why? Why this much? Why this high? Why this warm, when I've spent my life cold? And once the question is spoken, the story changes. The nobility didn't understand at first. They still held their titles like charms against reality. They still believed that by dressing finer, speaking smoother, they could ride out the storm. But the storm wasn't wind. It was memory. It was all the things the peasants had not forgotten. The years, the taxes, the children buried without names. Now those memories walked upright, in mud-streaked boots, with steady eyes. The reckoning wasn't swift. It was slow, like winter coming over the hills. Some lords fled, others begged. Some were left alone, not out of mercy, but because once you've been seen clearly, you can never be feared the same way again. And what the people saw was this, that behind the silk, behind the wigs, behind the bloodlines, and the rings, and the gold-leafed invitations, there was just a man, a tired, soft-palmed man, who had mistaken distance for divinity. The revolution had no anthem in that moment, only breath, only the sound of people realizing they were the story now. The king still wore his crown, but it no longer meant anything, because what the people took that day wasn't gold, or wine, or vengeance. They took back their place in time, and history, like the tide, began to pull in a new direction. Versailles had always been a stage. Its halls were not designed for utility. They were not meant to house, or warm, or comfort. They were meant to dazzle. Mirrors so wide they made the room feel eternal. Paintings thick with triumph. Ceilings so high they seemed to float, as though the gods themselves had taken rooms above. But stages need an audience. And on this day, the audience arrived uninvited. They didn't gasp. They didn't applaud. They looked, and the palace blinked under their gaze. The dust was the first surprise. For all its grandeur, the corners were thick with it. Not just literal dust, though there was plenty, but dust in the shape of negligence, of waste, of untouched rooms filled with chairs no one had sat in for 20 years. A place so obsessed with beauty had hidden its rot under velvet, but velvet sags, and now the rot was showing. The people walked not like thieves, but like archaeologists, uncovering, layer by layer, the myth of power. There were rooms filled with shoes, hundreds, some never worn. A woman who had walked barefoot most of her life picked one up and turned it over like a strange fruit, satin, pearl, useless. She didn't steal it, she placed it down. There were libraries full of books no one in the village could read, and even those who could did not care to. Because knowledge, when hoarded, becomes a wall instead of a bridge. There were chandeliers the size of hay carts, spilling light like spilled milk, and in a side room, a table laid for dinner, roast fowl, soft cheeses, fruit carved into flowers. It had been prepared for no one, or for someone who would never return. A boy maybe, 12, reached out and touched a fig. It was warm, and just like that, the spell broke. The king had eaten while they starved, and not just eaten forgotten that others did not. That was the sin. Not indulgence, but indifference. You can forgive a man who eats, but not one who forgets that you cannot. In another room, a seamstress found bolts of cloth worth more than her cottage. She didn't take them either. She sat on them, quietly, and wept, because suddenly she understood how much had been withheld. Not by fate, not by weather, but by choice. By men who had chosen to keep her in the cold, in the dark, in the dirt. And that knowing, that quiet, sick knowing, spread like ink in water. One man stood in the hall of mirrors for a long time. He stared at himself, and his reflection stared back. Dirty, thin, eyes red, but behind him, Versailles, not imagined, not in rumor, real. And he whispered, "So this is what they feared us seeing." Because now it was clear, the power had never been the palace. It had been the illusion, that some were born above, that some deserved comfort while others broke. And once the illusion shattered, Versailles was just a very big, very expensive lie. A monument to forgetting. The people didn't loot it clean. They didn't need to. They took something more permanent. They took the meaning away. And a palace without meaning is just stone. The throne still stood, upholstered in gold thread, surrounded by symbols of divine right and ancient lineage. No one sat in it, not out of reverence, out of boredom. Because once you've seen how the sausage is made, you stop believing it's a miracle. And when they left, when the villagers turned from mirrors and silk and chandeliers and walked back into the daylight, they carried nothing in their hands. But everything had changed. Versailles was no longer sacred. It was just a building. And the people, they were no longer peasants. They were witnesses to a collapse, to a beginning. They didn't cheer. They didn't sing. They just walked forward into a future still too dark to name, but theirs. The revolution didn't end that day. No revolution ends in a single moment. It stretches, frays, wounds, heals, forgets, begins again. But for those who had walked the halls of Versailles barefoot, mud-caked, silent, that day never left them. Years later, when governments shifted like sand, when tyrants rose, wrapped in new colors, when hope dimmed and flared and dimmed again, those survivors remembered. They remembered not the glamour, but the cold of the marble floors. How echoing footsteps did not sound like triumph, but like accusation. They remembered how the ceilings felt too tall, as if built to remind them they were small. But they were not small. That, above all, was the memory that endured. They had looked at the heart of their suffering and seen finally that it had never been sacred, that their hunger had not been holy, that their suffering was not ordained, that the divide was not heaven-sent, but man-made, and man could unmake it. Some of them lived to see heads fall into baskets, not always with joy. Revenge, like hunger, can sour in the belly. Some lived to see their sons conscripted by new masters, different uniforms, same boots, same mud. Some tried to rebuild the fields, the homes, the songs. But even as they mended, they carried that day like a secret flame, a knowledge that power, when it forgets the people, becomes hollow. That gold can blind, but not forever. That no throne, no matter how high, can survive a question. Why, they told the story to their children, not as myth, but as warning. They said, there was a place of mirrors once, and we saw ourselves in it, and we did not look away. They said, never forget that even the quietest voice, if spoken at the right moment, can undo a king. They said, we were not brave, we were not wise, we were simply done. And that was enough. They said nothing more. Because the rest, the children would learn in their own time. Because history does not sleep. It waits. And sometimes, when the night is long and the hunger deep, it wakes. When they finally left Versailles, they did not close the gates. There was no reason to. The place was open now, exposed like a wound, like a mouth that had bragged too long and finally been silenced. Its secrets lay in plain sight. Its splendor, once intimidating, now felt absurd. No guards returned to stand at the threshold. No one swept the marble clean. It stood still, a husk, a memory the wind could wander through. The birds came back first. They nested in the folds of forgotten drapes, flew through broken windows, calling to each other as if the halls had always belonged to them. Then came the ivy, climbing slowly, shamelessly, up walls that had once hosted kings. Nature doesn't respect hierarchy. It respects opportunity. Time did what time does. It peeled the wallpaper, warped the floors, faded the murals until angels looked like ghosts. Some rooms stayed pristine for a while, but without hands to dust them, without eyes to admire them, even gold dulls. Versailles did not fall. It settled into quiet, into echo, into the kind of stillness that only follows disbelief. They left some things behind: a scrap of bread, a child's ribbon, a boot with a cracked sole. These were not offerings. They were evidence, proof that the people had been there, had walked where they were never meant to walk, had seen what they were never meant to see, and had not been destroyed by it. Years later, some tried to restore it, paint over the cracks, sweep away the memory. Tours were offered, tickets sold, rooms renamed and reimagined. But something was missing, something irreversible, a presence. The throne was no longer feared, the mirrors no longer lied, and the palace, for all its marble and myth, felt smaller, as if being seen had shrunk it, had humbled it, had made it mortal. That was what was left behind. Not destruction, not glory, truth. And truth, once seen, cannot be unlearned. It lives on, in the stories, in the soil, in the sound of 1,000 feet walking home, not with triumph, but with certainty that they had changed something, even if only themselves. No one knew quite what to do the next day. The people had returned to their villages, to their crooked fences and thin soups and half-mended roofs, but something had shifted. You could feel it in the way they carried their tools, in the way they looked at the priest, the mayor, even each other, not with defiance, with recognition, as if to say, I saw Versailles, and now I see you. In some homes, the story of that day became folklore, retold beside the hearth, polished with memory, passed like a coin from hand to hand, always slightly altered, but never spent. Children asked what it looked like. The palace, the gold, the king, and their parents struggled to answer. Because how do you describe an illusion once it's gone? It was too much, they might say, or it was beautiful but wrong, or simply it was empty. Some of them kept small souvenirs, a scrap of silk, a tassel, a spoon, not out of pride, out of disbelief, as if needing proof they had truly walked through that dream. Most kept nothing, except memory. Memory is the most dangerous souvenir of all, because it lingers, and it whispers, and it waits. The king, wherever he was, no longer held the center of the world. Not really. The world had changed axes, shifted away from the throne, toward the table, toward the hearth, toward the street, a place where voices could rise. The revolution that followed would be bloodier than they imagined, more chaotic, more tragic, more unfinished. But that day at Versailles was not about violence. It was about clarity. It was the moment the spell broke, the day the lie lost its shine. And after that, even fear had less power. People spoke differently, even when they spoke quietly. Their silence once born of obedience, was now filled with choice, and the land itself seemed to listen. The fields, the trees, the rivers, they all remained indifferent and eternal. But somewhere under that same sky, a man lit a candle without praying first. A woman washed her child's face and did not apologize for the dirt. A girl picked up a stick, held it like a sword, and laughed, not because she wanted war, but because she had inherited something more precious than peace. The knowledge that dignity is not gifted. It is taken, claimed, held close like warmth in winter. And if Versailles taught them anything, if the long echo of marble and mirrors meant anything at all, it was this: that silence is not the absence of sound. It is the space in which truth waits. And the truth, once spoken, never forgets the voice that set it free. Thank you for staying with me through this quiet journey into the lives of those who history tried to overlook. I know it's late, and maybe your eyes are heavy now, or maybe your mind is still gently turning, trying to imagine what mud felt like between bare feet, or what silence must have sounded like in a golden hall. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you stayed. If this story kept you company, if it helped you rest, or think, or simply feel a little less alone, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it means we get to meet again. On another night, in another time, with another story whispered softly across the dark. Sleep well, take care of your heart, and I'll see you soon.